Our topic this evening is a book that scholars call Second Enoch, that has a subtitle, The Secrets of Enoch. There are 3 numbered books of Enoch. So we previously explored one that's generally called First Enoch, which is part of the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible. And so this first book of Enoch, it's just a book of Enoch, but anyway, that's numbered first by scholars, is sometimes called the Ethiopian or Ethiopic Enoch. But even though there's a first Enoch and a second Enoch and actually a third Enoch, unlike with other biblical books like First and Second Kings or First and Second Chronicles, which are actually just 2 parts of the same book. The reason why those are divided is that ancient scrolls could only be a certain length, and so if you have a double length book like Kings, you divide it into 2 halves, so First Kings and Second Kings. By contrast to a book like that, these books of Enoch, scholars have simply assigned completely unrelated books that are each claiming Enoch as an author numbers. And essentially they're kind of being assigned numbers in terms of their prominence, and actually it turns out probably the order they're composed. But certainly the second one here is really unrelated to the first and the third ones. So let's look at each of these as a brief overview. So the first one, like we say, we had a whole lecture on this. It's originally written in Hebrew and or Aramaic. We don't know because the complete text only survives in the Gez language, which is an Ethiopian language in that translation. Nevertheless, some parts of it were composed in either Hebrew or Aramaic as early as the 300s or 200s BCE. The second one could have been a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, just like Daniel. The second one, the one we're talking about tonight, survives only in complete form in the language known as Old Church Slavonic. That text purports itself to be a translation from Greek, and it probably is a translation from a lost Greek original. That Greek original, though, may well be possibly a translation from an additionally lost Hebrew original, and possibly that first text was written in the 1st century of the Common Era, the 1st century AD. And then there's a third book of Enoch, like I say, that is in Hebrew, but just because it's in Hebrew, that doesn't mean it's earlier. People continue to speak Hebrew. Rabbis are writing in Hebrew to this day. So it's later, probably from the 2nd century or maybe even later than that. And one of the ways we can tell it's kind of later is it contains Latin and Greek loan words. So this author may have known, certainly maybe the first book, the third book, the author may have known the first one and maybe the second one, probably the first one. But in any event, the second one, like I say, is unrelated to the first and third in terms of that author didn't know the other 2. Okay, so all 3 of these books are pseudepigraphic. That is, as we talk about it, that means they claim to be written by the biblical character Enoch, but they were actually written thousands of years later by someone else. I put a little star there because the third book of Enoch claims that it was written by Enoch, but then redacted in its present form by a rabbi in the 1st century or the 2nd century CE. So anyway, these texts fall into a large category of writings where ancient authors attempted to claim the authority of an even more ancient figure. And so I have these 2 volumes. As I said, I used to go to the library in junior high and check these out. And when I became an adult, I got to buy them, and so I was able to use the first volume to read here about the text, which is included for today. So let's look at some of the examples of what are these kinds of pseudepigraphic texts. Most of these date from either the Second Temple period, the late Second Temple period especially, or the first and second, third centuries, in other words, the time period after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And so the texts here have titles like The Life of Adam and Eve, The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, The Apocalypse of Elijah, The Treatise of Shem, The Odes of Solomon, and then there are, for example, a collection of more Psalms by David. So in general, in other words, the thing that has happened here is that authors are expanding on biblical stories. So the Adam and Eve story is actually really, really short in Genesis. It only fills a couple chapters at most. And so now the person has written more details of their lives and so forth for this expanded text. Or Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. So essentially all of the 12 tribes of Israel here get to have their say and give a blessing and so forth, their testament. So we don't otherwise normally get to hear from what Issachar or Manasseh had to say on any particular thing, and now these are all included as authoritative pronouncements from these legendary figures from the Book of Genesis. Likewise, Elijah is an important Old Testament prophet, and here he's having an apocalypse or a revelation, apocalyptic revelation. Shem is Adam's son. Solomon, David are famous kings, and so forth. So there is a practice here. We've called these pseudepigraphic. There is also a practice that has more legitimacy in the rabbinic Jewish tradition called midrash, which is a kind of biblical interpretation, and it's common in the Talmud. The word midrash means study or textual interpretation. Christians use the word exegesis for studying, interpreting scripture. So the practice can include expansion of biblical narratives in order to consider questions that are left unclear or absent in the original. So because the ancient texts in Genesis do not make certain things about, let's say, modern interpretation, or let's say even later ancient interpretation of Jewish law. They don't make anything clear. Sometimes the story is expanded to explain more about those kind of questions. Rewriting also therefore allows ancient texts to speak to more contemporary issues. And so, for example, I was mentioning that third Enoch, this third ones of this tradition, claims to be a redaction by Rabbi Ishmael, who was a 2nd century rabbi who is a founder of one of the midrash schools, and that became kind of a major school of this practice. So in some sense, these texts are sometimes we call them pseudepigrapha, but in some cases they also could be fit broadly into this practice of midrash. All right, so who was Enoch? So Enoch, why is he important enough for several authors to claim they were him or to write midrash about him or so forth? So Enoch is the English version of the Hebrew Enoch. And so Enoch is an important enough character in the Latter-day Saint tradition, so my own church's traditions, that I grew up hearing a very old American pronunciation of this. So we say Enoch, and a lot of people, when I hear me say that, it drives them crazy, but it also still it's very difficult for me to say Enoch, which is the more common English pronunciation for, like I say, the Hebrew, which is something like Henoch or something like that. So anyway, Enoch, we're going to try to say. Who was this guy? So he comes from what I call the begets section of the Bible. So this is made fun of in an episode of The Simpsons. So Homer, who thinks he's dying because he's eaten poisonous sushi, he breaks out the Bible, which turns out to be a book on tape as read by Larry King. And so Larry King starts reading the Bible, and it says, so-and-so beget Phineas, and Phineas beget Abushua. And Homer kind of starts fast-forwarding through this part. Abushua beget Anamus, Anamus beget, he fast-forwards some more, Amariah beget Ahoptep beget Shallum, and so forth. In other words, he has to fast-forward through all of these begettings that are happening in these long lists that occur in the Old Testament that are so boring for people to read. So what are these things? So the Book of Generations is a hypothetical source text of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, including the first book, Genesis. So the genealogical lists found in Genesis chapter 5 and also chapter 11 are used by the overall Torah's editor or redactor to connect different stories written by different authors together into Genesis to create a coherent narrative. And as a result of doing a lineage that is connecting essentially the Adam and Eve story to the Cain and Abel story, down to the Noah story, down to the Abraham story, and so forth, that gives the whole text a kind of quasi-historical feel, even though the text is not a history. So those separated, the genealogies, if you take them out, they actually fit together, which is why scholars think they may have originally been part of an independent source, which has been labeled the Book of Generations. So here's a portion, the beginning of the Book of Generations in chapter 5 of Genesis. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. When God created humans, he made them in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and called them humans when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. So this is after Cain and Abel, right? And so the days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enoch. And Seth lived after the birth of Enoch 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. Enoch lived after the birth of Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 905 years, and he died, etc., etc. So you can see why the Simpsons are making fun of this. This goes on a long time in the Bible. So this is the formula of the generations, and this is how we get the kind of family tree that takes us from Adam and Eve down to Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the text in Genesis 5 uses that same repetitive formula for all of the generations from Adam to Noah. The patriarch lives X number of years. He begets his son. He lives Y more years, begetting more sons and daughters, and then he dies. Thus he's lived a total of X plus Y years. So when you look at those different ones in terms of how long each one of them lived, not counting Enoch, the ages range from Lamech, who died at the very young age of 777, to Methuselah, who died at the age of 969. And so Methuselah is very famous for, when people have an old phrase, as old as Methuselah, right? So he's the longest lived person in the Bible, and that's what he's primarily famous for, because we don't know any other details about him other than that in the Book of Generations. All right, so I want to look at both the flood myth and also the myths of this time period before the flood, the antediluvian golden era. So just as the idea, as we've seen in a whole lecture when we had a lecture on the flood myth, just as that's not historical, there is actually no historical basis for any of the antediluvian stories or characters in Genesis. Why is that? So the Book of Generations, that text, is written thousands of years after, later than the characters would have supposedly lived, and there's no mention of any of their names in any other extra biblical sources. And then even in the Bible, when we take the older prophets, the older writings than the Torah, those prophets also don't know these names and they don't mention them, they don't talk about them. So we've talked about that, like I say, in a whole lecture on the flood myth. So where do these stories come from? The biblical flood stories were written no earlier than the 8th and more likely the 7th centuries BCE. There's another flood story, as we've talked about, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is written some 1400 years earlier. And the Sumerians also created king lists. And the king lists begin with mythological leaders who are said to have absolutely enormous lifespans. King lists are very much like these beget lists that we have in the Book of Generations. And so the Sumerian king list begins with 8 kings who reigned before the flood. The Sumerian antediluvian kings are actually much longer, preposterously longer than the reigns in the Book of Generations, although really living 1,000 years is also, once you're living 1,000 years, I guess you might as well live 28 to 43,000 years. So they vary between 28,800 years and 43,200 years. And so the total reign for all of these 8 kings, when added up together, is 241,200 years. So it's a long period of time as far as the ancient Sumerians are concerned, before the flood. And then after the flood, their kings are still long-lived, but the durations decline very rapidly. And so they start out, reigning like 1,500 years, and then they kind of slow down and cut down to 300 years. And finally, as they get closer and closer to actual history, that people are reigning for a realistic human time frame. So in the modern era, humans look at the record that we have. We have this increasingly technological, scientific, economic development. There are kinds of things that you are able to do, we're able to do. Right now, everything that we're doing here on YouTube, all of these live streaming and everything like that, the phones that we all rely on for everything, none of this was really even conceivable when I was born, right? So they didn't have these kinds of gadgetry really on Star Trek or, the original Star Trek or the Jetsons when I was born. I mean, they had some of the ideas, but not all of these ideas. So as of the mid-20th century, though, science fiction like Star Trek continued to envision that the future would inevitably follow those trend lines. So, for example, there was a 1939 World's Fair in New York, and its entire theme was the world of tomorrow, and everything, which was getting modern, was becoming to be more modern and more ultra-modern, and things were going to continue on those trend lines as everything was going to advance, and we would achieve kind of a technological utopia like they have in Star Trek. The ancient view is absolutely different. So the modern perspective is direct contrast to the ancient view. Ancients, by and large, believed that the past had been much better. So they looked back to the past and they imagined or remembered a golden age when life was much simpler, when food was abundant and easy to get, when the men were all more heroic, people in general were more virtuous, and everybody lived longer, and so forth. The Golden Age myth is very common across cultures. Just one example where it's very visually expressed is in the Book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he dreams of this giant statue, and the statue has a head of gold, shoulders of silver, torso of bronze, legs of iron, and then feet that are intermixed with iron and clay. And that represents the ages of man up until Daniel's day. And so the idea of it is that there was once, a golden age, then a silver age, a bronze age, an iron age, and now they were living in an age where everything was just muddy and iron mixed with clay. And so things were neither pristine and golden and wonderful, nor were they strong like iron. It was just all a mess. And so this is a vision of decline, which is generally how things were seen. Okay, and so as a result, these king lists, like the Sumerian king list or the Book of Generations, those list heroes and demigods whose lifespans decline from just impossibly long to more reasonable human ages of that kind of forms a bridge, a mythological or pseudo-historical bridge between the divine realm, the golden age, and then the mortal present. And so the authors of Genesis take that understanding of the past that was common. So the Mesopotamia, first the Sumerians, and then the different Semitic peoples, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and so forth. That worldview was spread across the Near East, and writing within that worldview are the Israelite authors who are trying to place their own narrative, their own sacred identity stories within that generally understood context that was created in Mesopotamia. And they try to then trace their own ancestors back to that golden age, what they're calling now paradise or Eden in the Hebrew narrative. So when you add up all of those numbers in the Book of Generations from Genesis, and for centuries Christians and Jews have done this. They've read these numbers literally. And so you can see in these charts, it starts here with Adam and then goes Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. And then you can see there's the flood, and you can see how fast they start decreasing after the flood, getting down ultimately to Abraham, who's only living 175 years at the end. And so the first little part here, the red part, is how long before they have kids, and then the gray part is how long do they live after they have their first child. And so you can kind of see how that goes. And so for centuries, like I say, Christians have added up all those numbers. They've seen how they would overlap by making a chart like this. But they primarily were doing this in order to try to create a chronology or manufacture a chronology in order to find the date of a literalistic creation. And so they'll come up with adding up all the estimates and things like that of having put the Bible together, the various stories. They try to look at clues and add all the numbers up, and they will come up with something like 4000 BCE or some other year like that. So I'm going to suggest that this is a completely, anyway, not a worthwhile practice, and it also opposes what ancient and even medieval ideas about science and what interpretation of Scripture. It's a modern literalistic interpretation of Scripture that is trying to reject science. So in his book that's actually called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, the 4th century Christian thinker Augustine, just again one of these greatest thinkers in Christian history, writes, usually even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and the moon, the cycle of the years and the seasons, about the kind of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. So in other words, what he's saying here is doesn't matter if you're Christian or not, people can know a lot about natural things, both astronomy and also weather and calendar, seasons, and biology and all that kind of thing. That's science, right? So people can know that. It has nothing to do with religion. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel, for a non-Christian, to hear a Christian who is presuming to give the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation. If they find a Christian mistaken in a field which they themselves know well, and hear him maintaining his foolish opinions about our books, in other words, if they hear a Christian say that the world is only 6,000 years old when everybody knows, because of just basic science, that it's over 4 billion years old, this is going to be horrible and embarrassing, and it is also going to discredit Christians. So how are non-Christians going to believe these books when they talk about religious matters, Augustine says, when they think their pages are full of falsehoods on facts, which they themselves have learnt from experience in the light of reason. So in other words, they know what science tells us, and now this Christian is telling us nonsense, and so that's going to make people think that the scriptures are full of falsehoods. So Augustine concludes that if your reading of scripture conflicts with what at the time was called natural philosophy, what we now call science, then you are clearly misreading scripture, and further, he suggests you're also just blaspheming. So Augustine suggests instead that you need to read texts meaningfully rather than always literally. And so in ancient times and all the way up through the Middle Ages, there is a hierarchy of responsible interpretation of Scripture. So yes, you can read it at first as literal, and like let's presuming that that happened, but it may turn out that it didn't happen. In any event, that's only the lowest and least important way that the text can be written. The next is reading it as an allegory. And so we saw how Philo of Alexandria, a learned Jewish scholar, philosopher in the first century of the Common Era, when it talks about, in the Old Testament, it talks about God's hands or God blowing or anything like that. He says that obviously is an allegory. We know that God doesn't have hands and God doesn't breathe. God is not physical, that kind of a thing. He ignores the literal. We have to look at the allegorical, is what ancient Jews and Christians are saying. More important than that, though, is what is the text telling us? What's the moral of this story, the tropological interpretation? And finally, the most important is the anagogical interpretation, reasoning upwards. How does all of this text point us to God, the source of light and truth, and so forth? So, since we have robust scientific models, like I say, that date the Earth to 4.54 billion years, plus or minus 0.5 billion years, so all of those literalistic readings that posit a young Earth, 6,000 years or so, are all false. They are also, by the way, disproven by the disciplines of history, archaeology, literary criticism, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there actually are interesting implications for these numbers. We can say they have no value for determining the age of the world, but they do have interesting implications within themselves because, in part, because there's this rapid decline of longevity in that post-flood era. So you can see how where the flood is here, and then on the other side, all the short little bars. So essentially right there. So according to Genesis, the way we have it in its present form, Noah is actually still alive when Abram is born in Chaldea, and when Abram now turns his name to Abraham, is 100 years old. Shem, Noah's son, Abraham's seventh great-grandfather, so great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, is still alive along with his son Arphaxad, his son Selah, and Eber. They're all still alive, and Shem even outlives Abraham according to Genesis. Okay, why aren't there any biblical stories about Abram hanging out with Noah? If the Bible indicates that Abram and Noah were alive at the same time, shouldn't there be a story? Wouldn't Abraham go and visit Noah? The answer is the Abraham stories come from different authors than the Book of Generations. The authors who wrote the Abraham stories had no idea that Noah was supposed to be still alive in Abraham's day. In fact, one of them had a definite time limit for how long humans were allowed to be alive, and it's only a little over 100 years and so forth, and so would not have agreed that Noah or anybody else, Adam or anybody, had lived that long. So that is what has happened is that different sources have been combined together. They're now all read together as Genesis and as the Bible, and so the implications of the stories don't work out. There's internal contradictions. Later authors, however, who have access to the composite text, in other words, we can all read Genesis the way it is, they and we have read Genesis edited together the way it is today. And so as a result, they have written stories about young Abram interacting with Noah. So for example, we did an entire lecture on the Book of Jasher, I call it, Book of Jashar. This is a medieval Jewish midrash on the Genesis story, so it's expanding Genesis. And it has a big, long story of Abram after he flees the land of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel is, and his father Terah has all these idols and so forth. Abram flees and he goes and lives with Noah and Shem for a little while, and they help teach him and so forth. So that becomes a common rabbinic midrash, this idea of that happening. So, with all of that background on Genesis and the antediluvian patriarchs in general, so I want to look at us now. What does the Bible tell us about Enoch in particular? And so Enoch here on this chart is this little short stubby one. So you can see how long all the antediluvian patriarchs are living. And Enoch, it's only 65 years that he begets Methuselah, and then 300 years, and that's it. So concerning Enoch's father, Jared, we read in Genesis 5, when Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. Jared lived after the birth of Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And then concerning Enoch, we read, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. Okay, so that is one of the very few variations in the Book of Generations. All the other ones have the same formula. But all we know then from Genesis about Enoch is, one, he lived a much shorter time than the rest of the antediluvian patriarchs, that he, quote, walked with God, and three, that God took him. However, this really plausibly is simply a euphemism for him dying by misadventure rather than old age. So God took him could just mean he had an accident, he fell down, God took him, or something like that. Nevertheless, readers haven't jumped to that conclusion usually. Rather, they're intrigued by these phrases, he walked with God, God took him, and they prefer to offer interpretations and extrapolations that are much more exciting. All right, so the translators in the 3rd century BCE who translated the original Old Testament Hebrew Bible text into Greek, the Septuagint translators, they used the Greek word metatithemi to render that phrase, God took him. And that verb has the sense of moving from one place to another. In the King James Version, I think that this is like rendered as translate, which is also weird, but in any way it means like essentially the usage there is translated not from language to language, but actually from space to space, what we might call transporting, like a transporter, like in the Federation, or like in Star Trek. So the same sense, this idea that God is moving him from one place to another, is found in the 3rd century BCE Book of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, which says, it talks about Enoch a couple places. One of them it says, Enoch pleased the Lord and was taken up, an example of repentance to all generations. And so we also have here like a medieval manuscript that is depicting Enoch being taken up into the heavens by God. He's climbing essentially Jacob's ladder, the ladder between heaven and earth. So Revelation in general did not cease in the Second Temple period of Judaism, even though most of the books did not make it into anybody's canon. Some of them, like the Book of Daniel, did, but most of them did not. As we saw, the Hebrew canon is especially disinterested in the later books. Those became brought into the Septuagint, into Greek, and those became parts of the canon of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. The Protestants have likewise rejected them and called those Apocrypha. Nevertheless, they sometimes look at the Apocrypha. So the most common style of revelation evolved away from the kind of direct poetry sort of visions that are in the original Isaiah anyway. There's a later Isaiahs that are apocalyptic, later continuers of Isaiah within the book of Isaiah. But the original prophet Isaiah would essentially write complaints and denounce the king and so forth. He would do that, or the people in general, in the form of poetry, and talk about direct visions that he's having of God. And same thing in the prophet Jeremiah. Apocalyptic visions tend to take that like one more step removed from God. So as monotheism is developing and evolving within Judaism, it becomes less common to be feeling like you can see God face to face. And instead, usually these are through angelic messengers, as we have in the book of Daniel, the very last book to be written that made it into the Hebrew canon. So, as we saw in a previous lecture, the first book of Enoch, or Enoch, what's now called First Enoch, the Ethiopian Enoch, fits into this newer apocalyptic prophecy very, very well. There's all kinds of angelic visitations and visions of heaven and so forth as Enoch is brought up into heaven. And this other book, Second Enoch, follows the exact same genre. So the word apocalypse comes from the Greek word apokalypsos, which means unveiling, which is the same as revelation, so we're taking the veil off. Apocalypses come in response to unfulfilled earlier prophecies and also failures of the earlier Deuteronomic answer to the problem of evil. So Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and all of these kinds of texts, the texts of the Deuteronomic historians, so Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, and so forth, the implication of all of those very directly is that Israel is punished when they turn away from the one God and stop keeping the commandments and instead bring in foreign customs and bring in polytheism, paganism, and start worshiping all of the neighboring gods of the Philistines and the Moabites and so forth, the Midianites. All of that has stopped in the Second Temple period. The people are now monotheistic, and yet they are continuing to suffer. So first under Persian rule, where they are essentially a struggling poor. Judah is Yehud is what it's called in the Persian period, is a poor little province of the Persian Empire. The footprint of Jerusalem significantly contracted from the time period that when Judah was an independent kingdom back to this time period as a Persian province, and same thing under the Hellenistic kings, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, Mesopotamia. And so even though the people are actually now fulfilling these promises, they are not being rewarded the way all of the biblical books before this promised they would. And so how do we explain that? Well, they have new ideas to understand the cosmos that they're drawing from. The Persians have a very powerful world religion called Zoroastrianism that has ideas about cosmic dualism, a great spiritual God who is fighting against a God of evil and will ultimately, at the end of the world, defeat him. There will be saviors of the world, people who inform the ideas of the Jewish Messiah. And also, the Zoroastrians predict that the world, this imperfect world, is going to be destroyed, and there will be a new world created that will be a restoration of paradise. And paradise is even a Persian loanword, so that's actually coming from Persian. So then these Persian ideas that are being drawn upon now. So Second Enoch fits into the category of an apocalypse in addition to being a pseudepigraphic midrash. So the story component of the text is pretty brief, and the vast bulk of the text covers a vision of Enoch as angels escort him through the 10 heavens, where he meets God face to face and learns all of the secrets of the universe. And the final sections are then after he comes back, teachings, temporarily comes back to earth, teachings, last kind of teachings he gives to his sons, and then kind of a succession, priestly succession from his son Methuselah and thereafter. So that's how the text goes. So as I said kind of at the outset of this, Second Enoch survives in Old Church Slavonic. And there's actually 20 manuscripts and fragments that are in Old Church Slavonic, but all the complete texts are in that language. There's only, and there are no fragments, I think, even in Greek or Hebrew. The only thing that we have are fragments in Coptic Egyptian. So Slavonic was current in the 9th century AD when Byzantine Greek missionaries were Christianizing Bulgaria. So Bulgaria is just right outside of it's in Thrace, so just very, very close to Constantinople. That's just how close the, what the Greeks were calling barbarians anyway, but how close the Bulgarian people were to the Byzantine Empire. And the missionaries created the Cyrillic alphabet, which is variations of which are still being used by Slavic peoples today. So Slavonic, this ancient or medieval language, early medieval language, continued to be used as a liturgical language. So the priests translated all of the religious texts into Slavonic, even though vernacular Slavic languages continued to evolve. So ultimately forming Bulgarian and Serbian and Ukrainian and Russian and so forth. In other words, they all became different languages, but the religious language continued to be static, and so was used for a whole long time. The same way Latin continued to be used even as Italian and French and Spanish were evolving. Okay, so Second Enoch has a pretty uncertain provenance. So there might have been a Hebrew original from the late 1st century of the Common Era, but it doesn't survive. There might have been a Greek version that is a translation of that, or it could have been composed in Greek with where the person was very seriously writing with Hebraisms, so they're writing in Greek but writing it to sound like it was a Hebrew original. What we do have is a very long I should say long version and short version. I have two short versions there anyway. We have Slavonic short versions and Slavonic long versions, but it was not clear which is the original. And so there's an original Slavonic version that claims to be a translation from the Greek. And it does seem that's most likely the case because we also have, like I say, these Coptic Egyptian fragments. And it seems unlikely that anybody would have translated directly from Slavonic into Coptic, that they're more likely the people in Egypt have gotten a hold of a Greek version that they've translated. But in any event, we don't really know for sure what's going on with this. Most likely scenario is that there's probably for sure a Greek version that's probably from the 1st century, maybe based on a Hebrew version. So let's look at the contents of Second Enoch. So the first 22 chapters, Enoch is taken through the 10 heavens by 2 angel guides. That's followed by, from chapters 23 to 37, spending time in the 10th heaven, where Enoch actually sees God face to face and sees visions of the future and learns the secrets of nature. Then Enoch is sent back to earth for a brief period of time, which he uses to give a bunch of ethical teachings to his sons. And then there's just a little end at the end, last few chapters, which is called the exaltation of Melchizedek, which essentially outlines the priestly succession. So the priest after Enoch is his son Methuselah, and then that goes on to a character called Melchizedek, which we'll explain. And then in the long version only, there's also just a final chapter that is telling a very brief summary of the flood story. So I'm taking this out of my volumes here of James Charlesworth's Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. And so all the quotations are actually from Anderson's translation of the longer version, Manuscript J. So let's look at the text. So this is the preface. The story of Enoch, how the Lord took him to heaven. There was a wise man and a great artisan whom the Lord took away, and he loved him so much that he might see the highest realms, and of the most wise and great and inconceivable and unchanging kingdom of God Almighty, and of the most marvelous and glorious and shining and many-eyed station of the Lord's servants, and of all the Lord's immovable throne, and of all the ranks and organization of the bodiless armies, and of all the indescribable composition of the multitude of elements, singing of the army of the cherubim, and of the light without measures, to be an eyewitness. So then in the next part, the angelic visitors come. At that time, Enoch said here, when 165 years were complete for me, so this is in his voice, I, Enoch, fathered my son Methuselah, and after that I lived 200 years. I completed all the years of my life, 365 years. In the first month, on the assigned day of the first month, I was in my house alone, and I lay on my bed sleeping. And while I slept, a great distress entered my heart, and I was weeping with my eyes in a dream. And I could not figure out what this distress might be, nor what might be happening to me. Then 2 huge men appeared to me, the like of which I had never seen on earth. And we have a description of these 2 men, these angels. Their faces were like the shining sun. Their eyes were like burning lamps. From their mouths fire was coming forth. Their clothing was various singing. Their wings were more glistening than gold. Their hands were whiter than snow. After these angels tell Enoch, do not fear, they explain that the purpose of their visit is to take him to heaven. Enoch gives some hasty instructions to his sons. Wait for me, I'm coming back, don't worry, I don't know what's going on, this kind of thing. And then the angels take him up on their wings, they take him above the clouds and into the ether, placing him on the first heaven. And so let's look at what each of these heavens are like. So normally, how many heavens are there? So this idea that there's 10 heavens, normally I think the phrase that is most common is 7 heavens. And 7 heavens, it'd be what you'd expect in the normal, let's say, Ptolemaic cosmos that is familiar to everybody in the Roman Empire. So the earth is a sphere, as they knew in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, and it's surrounded by 7 heavenly spheres, each of one of which is where the planets are. And planets are originally meant simply all the moving objects in the sky. So the sun and the moon are also planets in the original conception of what a planet is. And so the orbits are Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the stars are in the outermost. So those would normally be what you would think of as the seven heavens. In Enoch here, there are 10 heavens, so it's a different cosmos, and actually what each is in each heaven is kind of unexpected, or was unexpected to me, so it'll be interesting to show. So in the first heaven, Enoch sees angels governing the movements of the planets and the weather. Some of this is similar to what God is speaking from the whirlwind in the book of Job, where God talks about keeping snow in a great warehouse so that he can use it when the snow comes and so forth. So they placed me on the first heaven, and they showed me a vast ocean, much bigger than the earthly ocean. This is the idea from the Mesopotamian cosmology that above the sky there's a firmament, like a force field, and that force field is preventing a bigger cosmic ocean from flooding the earth. And God opens the firmament, opens the force field in order to cause the universal flood. So when he gets to the first heaven, there's an ocean that's much bigger than the earthly ocean. Then they showed me the 200 angels who govern the stars and the heavenly combinations, and they fly with their wings, and they do the rounds of all the planets. And there I perceived the treasuries of the snow and ice, and the angels who guard their terrible storehouses. So all the snow and ice and everything like that, that's all been pre-made in a factory up there, and it's in a warehouse ready to go whenever God wants to make a snowstorm. The treasury of the clouds, from where they come out and go in. So the clouds are all kept up in their different storehouses and pens. When you need a cloud, you let it out, it goes all around the earth, and then it goes back in the storehouse and so forth. And those men picked me up and brought me up to the second heaven. And they showed me, and I saw a darkness greater than the earthly darkness. And there I perceived prisoners under guard, hanging up, waiting for the measureless judgment. And those angels have the appearance of darkness itself, more than earthly darkness, and unceasingly they made weeping all the day long. So strangely, and if you might have just been expecting, even like Dante, where hell is a whole different kind of place maybe in the underworld, and heaven is a bunch of good places that are increasingly better, and so forth. In this case, it seems like hell is in heaven in the cosmology of Second Enoch. So meanwhile, in the third heaven, Enoch actually sees the Garden of Eden. So he got up to the third heaven, and he says, "Then I looked downward, and I saw paradise. And that place is inconceivably pleasant, and I saw the trees in full flower, and in the midst of them was the tree of life," this tree that is central to the Garden of Eden story in Genesis, "at the place where the Lord takes a rest when he goes into paradise." The Garden of Eden is therefore not on earth, but it's up in the third heaven, which the angels tell Enoch, quote, "has been prepared for the righteous as an eternal inheritance." So in other words, people, when they are righteous, when they die, they're going to go and live up here in the third heaven, in the paradise, which is actually the same paradise as Eden. But interestingly, as he goes now and explores the rest of the third heaven, it also includes a very frightful place with all kinds of torture and torment that are reserved for the wicked. So the third heaven is essentially the eternal resting place for both righteous and wicked humans. The fourth heaven returns us to kind of the cosmological realm with the orbits of the sun and the moon and great gates which God created to be an annual horologe. So then the men carried me away to the west of the heaven, and they showed me 6 large open gates corresponding to the circuit of the eastern gates opposite them, where the sun sets according to the number of days, 365 and 1/4. God's very crazy number that he came up with. So the text also then goes through 2 very obscure calendar systems, one lunar and one solar. There are whole bunches of other things. I'm just pulling, these descriptions are actually really long. I'm just pulling a couple interesting things out of each heaven. So for the fifth heaven, Enoch sees innumerable armies of giants whose faces are dejected, and he asks the two angels who are guiding him, "Who are these people?" The angels reply, "These are the Grigori, who turned aside from the Lord, 200 myriads of them, together with their prince Satanael." So Satan is a pretty obvious name there. "And similar to all of them are those who went down as prisoners in the train, who are in the second heaven, imprisoned in great darkness." So, in other words, unlike many visions of heaven, there are celestial prisons on the second and fourth and fifth heavens out of the 10 heavens. And so this includes the hell here, where Satan and all of the Grigori, as they're called here, all of the fallen angels of the higher ranks. The lower ranked ones are down in the second heaven. So the sixth and seventh heaven. The sixth heaven contains 7 groups of angels that are spending all their time carefully studying the movement of the stars and the planets. Second Enoch, I think, is kind of interested in astrology, I think, as part of this. The seventh heaven contains, quote, all the fiery armies of the great archangels and the incorporeal forces and the dominions and the origins and the authorities and the cherubim and the seraphim and the many-eyed thrones. And so thrones and dominions and so forth, these are all different tiers of archangels in angelology that are evolving in the Second Temple period as the angelology is being elaborated. So when he gets to the edge of the seventh heaven, Enoch is able to see God's throne way off in the 10th heaven. And he's now met by the archangel Gabriel, traditionally the herald of heaven, who takes him past the 8th heaven, which is called Mazzuloth, the changer of seasons, and he takes him past the 9th heaven, which is called Kuchavim, where the heavenly houses of the 12 zodiacs are. Again, he's like interested in astrology here, and he probably, and brings him directly to the 10th heaven, which is called Aravoth. So in the 10th heaven, Enoch says, I saw the view of the face of the Lord, like iron made burning hot in a fire and brought out, and it emits sparks and is incandescent. Thus even I saw the face of the Lord, but the face of the Lord is not to be talked about. It is so very marvelous and supremely awesome and supremely frightening. And who am I to give an account of the incomprehensible being of the Lord and of his face, so extremely strange and indescribable? And how many are his commands and his multiple voice, and the Lord's throne supremely great and not made with hands, and the choir stalls all around him, and the cherubim and seraphim armies, and their never silent singing. And the Lord summoned one of his archangels, Revoil by name, this is one I've never heard of before, who was swifter in wisdom than the other archangels, and who records all the Lord's deeds. So the historian angel, and the Lord said to Revoil, bring out the books from my storehouses and fetch a pen for speed writing and give it to Enoch and let him read the books. So then now in the next section in chapters 23 through 37, Enoch is taught about the great secrets of God, including everything about the heavens, the movements of the sun, moon, planets, the calendar, the elements, the weather, languages, music, and really everything about human life that is, quote, appropriate to learn, unquote. So just to kind of catch in where we're at then. So we have those first 22 chapters taking us through the 10 heavens. And we have this very long section where, having seen God face to face, Enoch is now learning all of these different secrets of nature. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that but because this will get way too long if I did, but there's interesting stuff in there too. Then we get to the part where Enoch is returned to earth to preach. So the Lord has an ice angel chill Enoch's faith so that mortals can again look at him without burning up. So there is an idea that's in the Pentateuch that when Moses sees God, he's unable to be seen properly again, and so he's veiled Moses. And so in the same exact way, Enoch's face here is temporarily put in the refrigerator here so that the flames that it has now become, he's become like the angels. The other people back on earth are still going to be able to see him. The original two angels are assigned to return Enoch to earth, where his sons have been faithfully waiting up for him. It's been a month or something like that. Enoch gives a very long speech beginning, "Give heed, my children," and he begins by recounting some of these heavenly wonders that he's seen before he moves on to a whole long set of moral teachings. One of them really stuck out at me as the first list. He has a list. He actually has two different lists of beatitudes. One blessed are the and cursed are the, but essentially happy are the, same as blessed are the. So I want to share these, which I found interesting. Happy is the person who reverences the name of the Lord and who serves in front of his face always and who organizes his gifts with fear, offerings of life, and who in this life lives and dies correctly. Happy is he who carries out righteous judgment, not for the sake of payment, but for justice, not expecting anything, whatever is a result, and the result will be that judgment without favoritism will follow him. Happy is he who clothes the naked with his garment, and to the hungry gives his bread. Happy is he who judges righteous judgment for orphan and widow, and who helps anyone who has been treated unjustly. Happy is he who turns aside from the secular path of this vain world and walks in right paths, and who lives that life which is without end. Happy is he who sows right seed, for his harvest shall be sevenfold. Happy is he in whom is the truth, so that he may speak the truth to his neighbor. Happy is he who has compassion on his lips and gentleness in his heart. Happy is he who understands all the works of the Lord performed by the Lord and glorifies him. So, although teachings by Beatitudes, by saying happy is the he or blessed is he who that does this, that's obviously very famously associated with Jesus. And whereas you can find some common themes here about orphans and widows and so forth, nevertheless, none of Enoch's Beatitudes are directly dependent on any New Testament text. Indeed, none of the teachings in 2nd Enoch come from any New Testament texts. And so there are, in this overarching tradition, 20 manuscripts or so, there are some Christian glosses, which means where a Christian scholar has added stuff like Christian ideas and stuck them in there, but they're only in individual manuscripts. And so the translator here, Anderson, argues that they're very obvious interpolations. And so when you look at the tradition as a whole, he says, quote, "There's not a distinctively Christian idea in the book," which is interesting because there are obviously, what it is sort of showing is, if this is a non-Christian 1st century CE Jewish writer, you can see that there's a bunch of overlapping ideas anyway with what 1st century Jewish Christians are writing about, including what Jesus is talking about. Here's an example that doesn't seem very particularly Christian. So Enoch talks about animal sacrifice as an example. So he who acts lawlessly with the soul of an animal acts lawlessly with his own soul. For a person brings one of the clean animals to make a sacrifice on account of sin, so that he may have healing for his soul. If he brings it to the sacrifice from clean animals and birds and cereals, then there is healing for that person, and he will heal his soul. So obviously, animal sacrifice was very central to Jewish religious practice during the Second Temple period. In other words, anytime up until the year 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple, but it's not a part of Christianity at all. So this is the kind of thing, this wouldn't make it into any kind of Christian text, and it actually probably might not have been a part of, say, a rabbinic text really after the destruction of the temple when sacrifices aren't even possible anymore. So it would be very unusual if the author here is a Christian or even a later rabbinic Jewish observant Jew. Okay, so after Enoch gives all of those big long speech of commandments and instructions and so forth to his sons, we get this ending to his narrative. When Enoch had spoken to his people, the Lord sent the gloom onto the earth, and it became dark and covered the men who were standing and talking with Enoch. And then the angels hurried and grasped Enoch and carried him up to the highest heaven, where the Lord received him and made him stand in front of his face for eternity. Then the darkness departed from the earth and it became light, and the people looked, but they could not figure out how Enoch had been taken away. And they glorified God, and they found a scroll on which was inscribed, "The Invisible God," and then they all went home. So there's a big puff of smoke or whatever, Enoch disappears, and all that's left is a scroll that says, "The Invisible God." And meanwhile, Enoch's reward is he gets to stand in front of the face of God forever. So, which is, anyway, it doesn't sound great in a literal thing, but if in a Platonic spiritual sense, that would be, that's the ideal. Okay, so that kind of brings us through then this guide of the 10 heavens, the secrets books, checking out the books from God's library, and finally these ethical teachings to his son. So that takes us to this exaltation of Melchizedek text. So after Enoch is taken up to heaven, his son Methuselah is made the priest in his stead. Methuselah lives his whole long life, and then at the end of his life, he decides to pass, or he is commanded to pass his priestly office to Noah's younger brother, Ner, a guy who does not exist in the Bible, but is an additional character we now learn about here in 2nd Enoch. So Ner has a wife named Sopanim, and she has been barren, so a problem that is very frequent in biblical texts where woman has gone to old age and has not ever had any children. She and her husband are also not having intercourse. Nevertheless, she miraculously conceives, and so is having essentially an immaculate conception and birth, and she gives birth to a child which is named Melchizedek. The archangel Michael, and Melchizedek is then made the priest after Ner. So Michael brings Melchizedek to Eden, which, as we know from this book, is actually not on earth. It's in the third heaven. And while he's up there in paradise, Melchizedek is able to survive the flood, and that kind of gives him an origin story. So where is this very obscure character, Melchizedek, from the book of Genesis, a person who is a priest of Salem, a person to whom Abraham actually gives tithing, a person who Abraham considers as his spiritual authority? Where does this guy come from? So the answer, anyway, there's lots of answers. The answer that people write in midrash, the answer from the book of 2nd Enoch is he is an otherwise unknown, immaculately conceived great-grandson of Methuselah, great-great-grandson of Enoch. So this text then is an interesting text, and it has an interesting survival. If it was written by a Christian, the author has done kind of a remarkably good, probably way too good a job of avoiding anachronisms, of including obvious Christian thought in his Old Testament settings. And I'll just say, for example, this is a feat that Joseph Smith, for example, in his writing of the Book of Mormon, which is taking place in Old Testament times, he's not remotely able to do this. He immediately introduces anachronisms and has all kinds of contemporary Christian doctrines which are set back in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, the time of Zedekiah or Zechariah or whatever. Anyway, the times when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. This guy does a great job if it is, which is why most people think it's not. In other words, it's a person who is a Jewish writer, probably from the 1st century, who simply has a bunch of interests in common with other Second Temple Jews, including the early Jewish Christians. So the text's cosmology is pretty unique, I think. It's different from the standard Christian Ptolemaic cosmology. The angelology is also kind of different from, let's say, the angelology that exists in the other Book of Enoch and in other texts. And so that may explain why this text wasn't continued to be copied in either Hebrew or Greek. So if there was a Hebrew original, and there certainly probably was a Greek original, why don't those continue? Well, they don't continue when people don't use the book and don't have a purpose in copying it. Which kind of also then begs the question, why do so many manuscripts survive in Old Church Slavonic? Who is busy reading this in the Slavonic language, and why it has survived? So, interestingly, 2nd Enoch was heavily used by the Bogomils, which were a Christian dualist and also neo-Gnostic sect founded by a priest named Bogomil, and that just means dear to God in Old Church Slavonic, in 10th century Bulgaria. So Bogomil dualism saw God It's pretty monotheistic. God is a superior being who has created, the infinite God is the creator of a spiritual world, but he has an elder son, Satanael, as the lesser creator of the material world, the flawed material world that's all around us. So one of the ideas of Gnosticism is that the spiritual realm is the higher, truer realm, and this material realm is where all the woe and sin is. And Michael has a very august role as God's second son, younger brother of Satanael, who is ultimately sent to earth and takes on human form as Jesus in the Bogomil understanding of this. And then Jesus is adopted as God's only begotten son. So they're adoptionists in addition to being neo-Gnostics and dualists. So there's a bunch of interesting cosmological overlaps with the Enoch text that we've just read. So second Enoch is uncompromisingly monotheist, doesn't make any mentions of Jesus. It does give significant roles to Michael and Satanael, and it also includes its own kind of war in heaven narrative that I didn't read for you, but anyway, that is in there. And it places, as we saw, the rebel angels in the second and fifth heavens, and we did see that. So the Bogomils went on to influence the Cathars, although I don't know that they got these ideas into the Cathars in the West, and we had a whole lecture on the Cathars. But both sects were persecuted by, in the West, the Catholics, and in the East, the Orthodox Christians, and they were eradicated as of the 15th century, so they don't exist anymore. Interestingly, there are some interesting parallels, I think, or echoes with a modern retelling of the Enoch story. So Joseph Smith wrote his own, had his own Bible revision and wrote his own story of Enoch. He portrays Enoch as a very powerful prophet who works amazing miracles. So we read in Joseph Smith's Bible revision, it's also called the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, or the inspired version of the Bible in some cases. And so great was the faith of Enoch that he spake the word of the Lord, and the earth trembled, and the mountains fled, even according to his command. And the rivers of water were turned out of their course, and the roar of lions was heard out of the wilderness. And all nations feared greatly. So powerful was the word of Enoch, and so great was the power of language which God had given him. So he's got power words of power that he's using to move mountains around and so forth. And the giants of the land, so in Genesis we read that there are giants in the antediluvian times. So the giants in the land also stood afar off, and there went forth a curse upon all the people which fought against God. And from that time forth there were wars and bloodsheds among them. But the Lord came and dwelt with his people, and they dwelt in righteousness. And the fear of the Lord was upon all nations, so great was the glory of the Lord which was upon his people. And the Lord blessed the land, and they were blessed upon the mountains and upon the high places, and they did flourish. And it came to pass in his days, he built a city, and it was called the city of holiness, even Zion. So Enoch tells the city of building a story of building a city, and that is the same as Zion. And so as Joseph Smith's story goes on, Enoch's city is so righteous that God eventually doesn't just take Enoch up into heaven, but the entire city of Enoch. And then there is the idea, as people were literal apocalypticists, that the second coming of Christ would come and the destruction of the world, and when that happens and the New Jerusalem is built, that also the city of Enoch would come back and it would take its place as either a suburb or part of the New Jerusalem and so forth. So the story inspired many peoples in the different Latter-day Saint tradition churches, including the Strangites, the LDS Church in Utah, and our own Community of Christ, to create cooperatives. So it could be like agricultural cooperatives where people are working together, sharing farm tools, helping each other with harvest and so forth. They're often called Orders of Enoch. And so that would be the name, the company would be called the Order of Enoch and so forth. And they also inspired later people to produce kind of social charities, things like orphanages, old age homes, senior centers, hospitals, and so forth. Our own, here in Toronto, Cienado Social Housing Charity was founded half a century ago in the same kind of tradition of trying to build Zionic or Enoch-like communities that are attempting to abolish poverty and suffering and so forth, as it's described in the city of Enoch, where they had everything in common and there was no poor among them, and so the Lord called it Zion. There's this weird echo in Mormonism. Maybe you have heard in the Utah theology, Utah LDS theology, there's the idea that the pre-existent Jesus and the pre-existent Lucifer are both literal sons of the Heavenly Father who offer competing plans of salvation. The pre-existent Jesus' plan is chosen. Lucifer is upset and it has a rebellion and ends up being fought off by Michael the archangel, and him and a third of the host of heaven are expelled, and Lucifer in his fallen form becomes Satan. So we saw that the Bogomils also have this idea that Satanael and Michael are sons of God, and they also participate in the same war in heaven, which is important in that, and it's also important in Second Enoch. Anyway, and just as one interesting thing, so for the Bogomils, Michael, the pre-existent, is the pre-existent Jesus, and so he becomes Jesus. So that isn't what happens. But Brigham Young had a peculiar doctrine out in Utah that Michael the archangel was the pre-existent Adam, and so he became Adam, I think, and Adam is God anyways. I'm not really sure how the Adam-God doctrine works, but essentially the idea is that Adam is the God of this world and so forth. This is a doctrine that the Utah LDS Church, after Brigham Young's death, repudiated, although it's still understood in some of the fundamentalist polygamist Latter-day Saint sects in Utah and elsewhere. So this is a particularly interesting book, and I hope you've enjoyed kind of this summary as we've looked at the second book of Enoch, or the Book of Enoch, the second one for scholars, sometimes called the Secrets of Enoch, sometimes called Slavonic Enoch. So let's get to your guys' questions. I'm going to get a quick drink of water.
We don't have a lot of questions.
Oh yeah, guys, come on, ask questions. We don't have too much questions. So, Nadav Kravitz says, why do you think the Genesis account says God took Enoch? What do you think the original authors meant? So I don't know. I'm suggesting that that it could have meant as something as simple as that there is that he died by accident. In other words, sometimes you will have a phrase, God takes somebody before their time, right? So God took him before his time. So it could just mean that. But it could. I don't know what the meaning is, and so it's a mystery. And so one of the reasons why it's one of the few things that we have out of that list that's interesting. The other one is in the second list, the post-flood list. There's a guy named Peleg. And he says, and he was called Peleg before in his day the earth was divided. It also isn't clear what that means at all, but it's just interesting. And so that has led to all kinds of crazy speculation. So for young earth creationists, they'll say that, well, yeah, sure, there was a Pangea or something like that, a supercontinent, but then in Peleg's day, the earth was divided. And so that happened just a few thousand years ago, not millions and millions of years ago. Thanks, Wendy, for your support. Thanks, Daryl Scott, for your support. D. Parker and Nadav also asked, could Second Enoch's 10 heavens be the source of Paul's cosmology in 2 Corinthians 2, where it says, taken up into the third heaven, taken up into paradise, and heard words not to be spoken, which no man can utter. That is so interesting. I haven't read that, so I'll have to look at that. Since the interesting thing here that is going on is paradise is here in the third heaven. And so that is not, so this is not something that I have seen otherwise. You haven't? So what do we have? Which is the, 2 Corinthians 12. Oh. Well, no, it's not necessarily a source. It's a reference. So a parallel exists in 2nd Enoch. So yeah, it's listed as a parallel, and also the Apocalypse of Moses. So this is an idea that is running around, and so it's an interesting parallel. And so since scholars have not posited that 2nd Enoch is dependent on Paul, and it doesn't necessarily mean that Paul is dependent on this. It could be that these ideas are floating around, that paradise is up in the third heaven, and I have to look at Apocalypse of Moses to see how it says that. Apocalypse of Moses 37:5. That's interesting. Leon asks, would Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon have had access to 2nd Enoch in the 1830s? And the answer is no, they did not have that. So they did, in the 1830s, I don't think they had anything other than the Bible and the Apocrypha. They later got a hold of, Joseph Smith later got a hold of the Book of Jasher and some other books, but they would not have been working from that in the 1830s. So this is when I was bringing up all of those things about Adam, God, and Michael and all that kind of thing, this is all totally coincidental. This is just echoes. And so this has nothing to do, and in fact, there's really very little in the main, it's kind of a weird parallel with the Bogomils. The main 2nd Enoch story is very unrelated, has almost nothing to do with the Joseph Smith Enoch story. The reason why Joseph Smith's Enoch story has a city in it is probably because there is a completely separate Enoch tradition, the descendants of Cain in Genesis, who are the first ones to build cities and be artisans and so forth. And so those are, it's probably confusion there. And Nadev Kravitz also asks, where did this apocalyptic idea and style of literature come from? Reveals angels revealing and vindicating future. Judaism, Zoroastrianism. James Tabor calls it the bad idea that took over the world. It certainly becomes popular here. So I think it's evolving here. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a direct influence. The stronger, more powerful culture at the time, though, is going to be the Persian imperial culture, Mesopotamia and Persia together, which are going to be influencing Judaism more than Judaism is influencing them, because Judaism is a much tinier little thing and not really as important at the time. So I guess I would suggest that sort of all of this idea of elaboration of angels and the end of the world and a cosmic battle between God and evil, and even the ideas of saviors and so forth, that it's probably the source of all of those, which were not part of First Temple Judaism. The source of all of that is most likely Mazdaism, so Zoroastrianism, Persian. It's from the Persians, or Mesopotamian Persians, too. Daryl Scott asks, how well has 2nd Enoch been known through history? So I think it is not very well known. So we do not have, there's not a lot of references to it. It's not like 1st Enoch, which is pretty well known to New Testament writers. Like I say, it also doesn't survive in its original languages, or what its likely original languages are. And so that's why we had to have all those question marks around the whole provenance slide, which is, we really don't know. The text, so it's possible it's written originally in Old Church Slavonic. That seems amazingly unlikely, because all of the ideas that are in it are so coherent with first century Second Temple Judaism, that kind of thing, and have very little parallel in, let's say, native Old Bulgarian culture, and so it does seem like it's almost certainly a translation from a Greek original at the least. But because we have so little mention of it, and it has so little influence in early on that we don't know. So I'd say not very much at all. Laurentius Beerton says, how has a Slavonic community adopted a Gnostic view of Christianity? Well, so there's all kinds of different reasons why, in a lot of cases, when you are in let's say when you're in a state that is at war with a powerful state economically, militarily, culturally. So the Bulgarian Empire, the first Bulgarian Empire, is essentially at war with, rebelling from, and declaring its independence and power against the Byzantine Greek Roman Empire, right? And so one of the things they need often, you still want to be part of a powerful world religion, so you adopt the religion, Christianity, but it sometimes makes sense to have have your own take on it, because if you have your kind of own independent branch of it, then you're not really subject to the patriarch of Constantinople anymore, because you can say that guy's a heretic. We know the real kind of Christianity. And so there are ideas floating around. There's a sect called the Paulicians that have been preserving Gnostic Christianity. They transmit some of their ideas apparently to the Bulgarians, which create the kind of the Bogomil church and so forth. It's probably very similar to the political dynamic at work with why all of the German barbarians who take over the Latin West, they all conquer Italy and Spain and Portugal and even North Africa and so forth, what becomes those countries. They conquer those from the Roman Empire. They do that as Christians, but they are Arian Christians, and so they have their own thing where their own kind of Christianity is heretical from the standpoint of Rome and the local Roman population, but that allows them to say, well, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about, and we know better, and that's why we conquered you. And so that's probably how we get a independent interpretation or sect of Christianity when there is a need to set yourself up against a political rival like Constantinople. Michelangelo asks, why do you think Enoch became such an important figure with mystics and alchemists, with stuff like Enochian language or the Corpus Hermeticum, for example, as Metatron? So as you mentioned with Metatron, so Metatron as an angel is in first Enoch, and so that entire angelology is really elaborated in first Enoch, and so it's a so it is a tradition that is going hand in hand. And First Enoch is a much more popular and well-known text, and so I think that popularizes Enoch as the important figure for mystics and alchemists in the same way. So once he is known for all of that from the first book of Enoch, that's kind of putting his foot into that camp. And the same thing, why Solomon becomes so important, right? So Solomon is also important for all of these kinds of mystics and alchemists, and even summoning demons and things like that, because Solomon is said to have power over, has learned all this wisdom and have all this power over it. And so Enoch is even in some ways, he's even a more powerful, earlier precursor than Solomon, because he's this guy who's living before the flood. So even though this is an apocalypse that we just read, as we saw, Enoch actually gets to see God face to face. That's not something that otherwise is happening, in the kind of post Moses or certainly post Babylonian captivity era. So Stephanie Ceresi asks, based on that quotation I have from the Book of Generations, where it says about Peleg, where it says, his name was that way, for the earth is divided in his day. Could that just mean like before there are boundaries, and so maybe that's divided into territories? Absolutely. When I was saying for in his day the earth was divided, and a modern interpretation has been that like the supercontinent of Pangaea was divided into into the Americas and the Old World and the New World. That was definitely not the meaning of that, because they had no idea of the New World. They had no idea of continental drift. That's a brand new scientific theory that's only only 150 years old or something like that. I mean, it's a very, very new, actually, continental drift. So it did not mean what I said. That's a modern interpretation, and it could mean, like you say, in his day the world was divided, so that could mean that it's divided into different countries. It could mean, it probably means, or it's a very good potential interpretation is that that's when the Tower of Babel story is supposed to have taken place. So in his day, the world is one, they were all one language, and after that they were divided, something like that. But it could be the boundaries. It could be just in his day the world was surveyed, and you suddenly could farm your own plot of land. Donnie Lane Gringo asked, would John repeat if Second Enoch is in the Apocrypha? No, it is not. Is that a different Enoch account? Enoch is not in the Apocrypha. Enoch is, the first Enoch is in the, it's, for most everybody, it's pseudepigrapha. It is in the Ethiopic Bible. So the Ethiopic and Eritrean Orthodox churches consider that to be part of the Old Testament, but it is not part of the Old Testament or the Apocrypha for Protestants. And so it's published in that big book of Pseudepigrapha that I was showing you. So volume 1 of Pseudepigrapha has 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch in it, but it's not in the Apocrypha. Daryl Scott says, what is the angel in the image on the screen right now? So that is actually Metatron. so actually Metatron isn't in 2nd Enoch. So I made that title screen before I had recently reread 2nd Enoch. So actually that should be illustrating 1st Enoch or 3rd Enoch. Metatron, that's Metatron the angel, who's not actually in 2nd Enoch. Nylon Diamond says, I thought Enoch turned into Metatron, or was that 1st Enoch or 2nd Enoch? So that's either 1st Enoch or 3rd Enoch. Or it's a later tradition based on 1st Enoch. It is not, so like you say, that's Metatron. It's not, the picture is Metatron, and I shouldn't have that up because it's relevant to the Enoch tradition, but it is not it's not as part of the story of 2nd Enoch. David T. asks, what's the nature of the Grigori under Samyaza who swore at Mount Hermon to take human wives and successfully reproduced with those wives to create the giants? So yeah, this is an obscure story that exists in Genesis. And so one of the few stories we have about the era before the flood is, like you say, the sons of God, however you want to say it. It's a lot of times interpreted here, like you're doing with the Grigori, the 2nd Enoch, name for the angels who have rebelled against God, that they come to earth and they take human wives, and then their children are the giants. So probably, the early accounts in Genesis are mythological, and they are attempting to explain, like the mythological or heroic age and so forth. And so there's an understanding in kind of the old-timey biblical mythology that there are certain giants, the last of which is essentially like Goliath. And so where did those come from? And so the idea of it is that they are this kind of demigod. So it's the same kind of a thing. Goliath is a giant, or portrayed as a giant, but he's also kind of arrayed as like a Homeric hero, like Achilles. And so Achilles is half god and half human. And so for monotheists, how do you account for half god, half humans? And so the way that this is explained here is having angels who are sons of God or whatever. Angels, a different order of beings, divine beings, create demi-divine, half human, half angel beings and so forth. Okay, so Michael Rogers asks, Enoch is often read literally, angelic visitors or alien visitors. Is this because it's so entertaining, or if it's entertaining or a largely cryptic tone? So these books have become really popular because they're so fantastical, right? And so people like people like magic. People like people would like all of kind of these wild, fantastic, fantasy-like stuff to be happening. And so I think that, like you say, one of the ways that we've said that a certain number of people identify as Jedi in England as their religion, right? But not most of them do not, aren't really so into it that they believe it. But if it would be true, I'm sure they would want it to be. Then there are people for whom this, because these books have antiquity, they're able, living in a counterfact kind of reality, they're able to say that this has, kind of a weight of authority and it exists in the material world or something like that. So that's probably why. But I just find these texts to be interesting in teaching us what they say about both ancient and then also medieval peoples, how they were reading these kinds of ancient texts and adding to the stories, elaborating on the stories, and so forth. And it's a tradition really that has come down to the present, as we saw even with Joseph Smith's midrash or restoration of new stories of Enoch. So want to thanks for all those questions, and thanks for participating in this lecture. I want to remind you to save the date for our upcoming lectures. So on June 13th, next week, we are going to talk about why Josephus matters. 2 weeks after that, on June 27th, we're going to talk about how Constantine changed history. And then the week after that, on the 4th of July, we will talk about why was Jesus from Galilee. So thanks again.